The air at the Nwachukwu estate smelled of money and memories. Adana stood before the mirror in her bridal chamber, adjusting the crystal-studded crown on her elaborate jelly. Her wedding dress, a masterpiece that combined contemporary design with traditional Igbo beadwork, caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. Outside, she could hear Lagos's elite arriving in their luxury cars, their voices mixing with traditional flute music. "The newest bride of the great Nwachukwu family," she whispered to her reflection, trying to calm her racing heart. Her fingers traced the string of coral beads around her neck, a gift from her mother-in-law that felt heavier than it should. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Adan?" Elisa's voice came through the door. "It's time." Her new husband's tone carried an edge she'd never heard before. Throughout their courtship, Elisa had been the perfect blend of Western sophistication and Nigerian values, the Oxford-educated heir who still respected tradition. But since this morning, something had changed. The wedding ceremony had been picture-perfect, the kind that would trend on Nigerian Instagram for weeks. Now, as sunset approached, the real celebration was about to begin. Yet none of the wedding planners had organized this part. No photographs would be allowed. Adana opened the door to find Elisa standing there, his black Agba making him look regal and distant. His usual warm smile was replaced by a tightness around his eyes. "Ada, before we go down?" He paused, taking her hands in his. "The family tradition I told you about, the midnight ceremony, it's not just a game. Elisa, you're scaring me," Adana said, trying to laugh it off. But her entrepreneur's instinct, the same one that had helped her build a tech startup from nothing, was screaming that something was very wrong. "Whatever happens tonight," he continued, "remember that I love you. But family tradition must be honored." Before she could respond, drums began to beat below. The rhythmic sound seemed to make the crystal chandelier above them tremble. Elisa's grip on her hands tightened. "They're calling us," he said. "It's time for you to select your fate." As they descended the grand staircase, Adana saw the entire Nwachukwu clan gathered in the great hall. The elegant wedding guests were gone. Only family remained, their faces solemn beneath their elaborate head ties and caps. In the center of the room, on a table carved with ancient Igbo symbols, sat 7 kola nuts arranged in a circle. One was stained a deep, unnatural red. Her mother-in-law stepped forward, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Welcome, bride of Nwachukwu. Are you ready to play?" The red kola nut felt warm in Adana's palm, unnaturally so for something that had been sitting on a table. Around her, the faces of the Nwachukwu family transformed from solemn observation to something darker. Her mother-in-law's elegant smile curved into a predatory grin. "Anya Zoburu," the old woman announced, her voice echoing through the great hall. "Hide and seek, the bride has chosen." Adana's tech-savvy mind raced to process what was happening. She'd done due diligence before marrying into this family, background checks, financial investigations, social connections. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. "You have until dawn," Elisa's uncle, Chief Benedict, declared. His voice carried the weight of centuries. "If we find you, the family continues. If we don't." He left the consequence unspoken. Adana looked at Elisa, but her husband had stepped back to join his family. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, love, fear, and something that looked terrifyingly like resignation. 5 minutes, her mother-in-law announced. "Run, bride of Nwachukwu. Run far and run well." The family began to chant in Igbo, their voices rising and falling like a tide of darkness. Adana stood frozen for a moment, her white wedding dress suddenly feeling like a beacon in the dimming light. Then her survival instincts kicked in. She ran. The Nwachukwu mansion was a maze of colonial architecture, mixed with traditional design. Adana's heels clicked against the marble floors as she fled down a corridor. Behind her, the chanting grew louder, then softer, as if the sound itself was hunting her. Finding a side room, she quickly stripped off her elaborate jella and outer dress, thankful she'd worn a fitted slip underneath. Her years growing up in the rough parts of Lagos had taught her to always be prepared for the unexpected. As she moved through the darkness, a sharp pain in her abdomen made her pause. The pregnancy test she'd taken that morning flashed in her mind. Positive. A baby. Their baby. Did Elisa know? Would it matter? The sound of footsteps echoing through the halls snapped her back to reality. She needed a plan. The mansion had 3 floors, 2 wings, and a basement she'd never been allowed to enter. The entire compound was surrounded by high walls topped with electric fencing. Her own suggestion to Elisa, ironically, for security. A flash of movement caught her eye. Through a window, she saw members of the family emerging from various doors, holding traditional items. Ceremonial daggers, beaded walking sticks that looked more like weapons, and what appeared to be ancient hunting tools. They moved with purpose, like they'd done this before. Near a corner she spotted a housekeeping cart. Quickly, she grabbed a maintenance uniform from it. If she was going to survive, she needed to think like the streetwise entrepreneur who'd built something from nothing, not like a frightened bride. Near a corner, she spotted a housekeeping cart. Quickly, she grabbed a maintenance uniform from it. If she was going to survive, she needed to think like the streetwise entrepreneur who'd built something from nothing, not like a frightened bride. The distant sound of a traditional horn blew 3 times. The hunt had begun. The maintenance uniform itched against Adana's skin as she crouched in the darkness of the wine cellar. Above, footsteps echoed through the floorboards. Hunters searching for their prey. She'd chosen this hiding spot carefully, remembering how Elisa once boasted that his family never came down here. They considered it beneath them to fetch their own wine. A rat scurried past her feet, and she bit back a scream. The cellar's musty air carried an odd smell. Something ancient and wrong, like wet earth mixed with copper. Her phone lay dead in her hands. Somehow, all networks had vanished the moment the hunt began. "We can smell your fear, bride of Nwachukwu." The voice belonged to Auntie Chioma, Elisa's father's youngest sister. Just yesterday, this same woman had helped adjust Adana's wedding dress, laughing and calling her my daughter. Now she stalked the halls with a ceremonial spear that looked too well maintained to be merely decorative. Adana closed her eyes, forcing herself to think. She'd built her tech company by analyzing patterns, finding solutions where others saw only problems. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. The baby moved inside her, too early to be really feeling anything, her rational mind knew, but somehow she felt a flutter of life, of defiance. A creak on the stairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descended into the cellar. The beam of a flashlight swept the rows of wine bottles, creating dancing shadows on the walls. "Little bride," came the sing-song voice of her mother-in-law. "I know you're clever. Your kind always is. Did you think we didn't research you too? The street girl who built an empire from her laptop? But cleverness won't save you tonight." Adana held her breath. Between the wine racks, she could see her mother-in-law's feet clad in expensive leather sandals that made no sound on the stone floor. The older woman held something in her other hand, a calabash that seemed to glow with a faint, sickly light. "The python must feed," the older woman continued. 20 years ago, I was in your place. I made the right choice. I survived. And now?" She laughed softly. "Now, I am the one who hunts." Something moved in the calabash, something that made a sound like dry scales sliding against clay. Adana's mind raced. Python? The pieces started falling into place. The Nwachukwu family's sudden rise to wealth 2 decades ago, the strange deaths of previous in-laws, the consistent pattern of success that defied normal business logic. A drop of sweat rolled down her back as her mother-in-law moved closer to her hiding spot. She needed a diversion. Her hand closed around a bottle of vintage wine. The entrepreneur in her knew it probably cost more than her first office space. "Found you." The flashlight beam hit her directly. Adana threw the bottle. The crash of breaking glass and splashing wine filled the cellar. In the chaos, she sprinted past her mother-in-law, knocking the calabash from her hands. Behind her, she heard the older woman's scream of rage, followed by a sound that couldn't have come from any human throat. The hunt was far from over. Adana's feet carried her to the one place she'd been warned never to enter, the family's private chapel. The heavy wooden doors groaned as she pushed them open, revealing an unsettling blend of Catholic iconography and traditional African religious symbols. A crucifix hung above the altar, wrapped in python skin. Blood trickled down her arm from where she'd cut herself during her cellar escape. In the moonlight streaming through stained glass windows, She noticed the drops falling onto the chapel's marble floor formed patterns that seemed to move on their own. They never told you about the Dibia's prophecy, did they? The voice made her spin around. In the shadows stood Uncle Namdi, the eldest living Nwachukwu, his traditional red cap marking him as a titled chief. Unlike the others, he carried no weapons. The python spirit didn't choose our family, he continued, stepping into the moonlight. We chose it. 1923. The British were squeezing our palm oil trade. Our great-grandfather consulted the most powerful Dibia in the 7 villages. Adana backed away, but found herself drawn to his words. The businesswoman in her needed to understand the deal that had built this empire. The Dibia warned that the price would be blood. Fresh blood to feed the python spirit every time new wealth entered the family through marriage. The old man's eyes gleamed. But he also prophesied that one bride would come who could break the cycle. One whose own power matched the python's hunger. A strange symbol began glowing on the chapel floor. The same mark that had been on the red kola nut. Your mother-in-law survived by accepting the python, becoming its priestess, Uncle Namdi said. But your coming was foretold. The bride who built her fortune not from the land or blood, but from the ether itself. Technology, the new magic. Before Adana could respond, a scream echoed through the compound, her husband's voice. Elisa was in pain. Choose quickly, daughter of new money, Uncle Namdi smiled, revealing teeth filed to points. Accept the python's blessing like your mother-in-law, or try to break the curse. But know this, your child's destiny was written in cobra venom before you met my nephew. The chapel doors burst open. Her mother-in-law stood there, the calabash now wrapped around her arm like a living bracelet, its contents writhing. Enough talk, the older woman snarled. The python hungers. The moon hung like a curse above the Nwachukwu estate as Adana raced through the open courtyard, her heart pounding against her ribs. Behind her, the sound of her mother-in-law's voice mixed with something inhuman, a hissing chant that made the very air feel thick and oppressive. Her phone suddenly buzzed, the first sign of life since this nightmare began. A single bar of network coverage flickered on the screen. In that moment, Adana realized technology wasn't just her business. It was her weapon. The old magic fears the new, Uncle Namdi had said. She finally understood what he meant. Ducking behind a massive Iroko tree, she quickly opened her banking app. The Nwachukwu family's wealth might have been built on blood and palm oil, but hers was built on algorithms and digital networks. Her fingers flew across the screen, initiating transfers, sending coded messages to her servers. A rustling sound made her look up. Elisa stood there, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead, his expensive Agba torn. Ada, he whispered, reaching for her. I tried to fight it, the python. It lives in all of us now. Even in our child? The words escaped before she could stop them. Elisa's face transformed. Joy, fear, and something darker fighting for control. A baby? Then the prophecy. His voice changed, becoming deeper, ancient. The child must feed the python first. Adana backed away from her husband, watching in horror as his eyes turned yellow, vertical pupils contracting in the moonlight. The python's power wasn't just a metaphor, it lived in their blood, passed down through generations of dark deals and bloody sacrifices. Her phone buzzed again. The transfers were complete. She just moved millions of naira through digital space, creating a pattern that mimicked the symbol from the red kola nut, but in electronic pathways instead of blood. What have you done? Her mother-in-law's voice boomed across the courtyard. The older woman stood at the top of the mansion's steps, the calabash now floating beside her head like a perverse halo. The same thing your family did in 1923, Adana replied, her voice stronger than she felt. Made a deal with a power you didn't fully understand. The ground began to tremble. From her phone, streams of digital code projected into the air, forming glowing patterns that clashed with the ancient symbols appearing on the mansion's walls. New magic meeting old. Silicon challenging blood. Elisa screamed as something inside him fought for control. Around them, the other family members emerged from the shadows, all with the same yellow eyes, all moving with the same serpentine grace. You think your technology can match centuries of tradition? Her mother-in-law laughed, but there was fear beneath the mockery. No, Adana smiled, one hand on her belly. the other gripping her phone like a talisman. I think it's time for the powers to negotiate a new deal. The night exploded into chaos as two worlds collided, with the fate of 3 generations hanging in the balance. Thunder rolled across the Lagos sky, though no rain had been forecast. The digital patterns flowing from Adana's phone battled with the ancient symbols that pulsed along the mansion's walls, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. You dare challenge powers older than your grandmother's grandmother? Her mother-in-law snarled, but her voice trembled. The calabash beside her head spun frantically, its contents writhing with increasing desperation. Adana stood her ground, technology and tradition warring around her. The banking algorithms she'd created were doing something unprecedented, converting digital currency into pure energy, matching the frequency of the python spirit's power. Years of coding and artificial intelligence development had prepared her for this moment, though she'd never known it. The python spirit feeds on blood and fear, she called out, her voice carrying over the supernatural storm. But what happens when you feed it data? Elisa convulsed nearby, caught between his human form and something else. Ada, he gasped, fighting for control. The prophecy, it wasn't about breaking the curse, it was about evolution. Understanding hit her like lightning. The baby in her womb kicked, impossibly strong for its age, as if responding to the energies swirling around them. This child would be neither fully of the old world nor the new, but a bridge between them. Her phone screen cracked, golden light pouring from the fissures. Banking records spanning a century began manifesting as physical symbols in the air, every blood-bought naira, every sacrifice-stained transaction becoming visible. The python spirit's financial web exposed in digital clarity. Stop this! Her mother-in-law raised her hands, dark energy crackling between her fingers. You'll destroy everything we've built. No, Adana replied, her free hand moving to protect her belly. I'm upgrading it. The calabash exploded. Something massive and scaled emerged, but instead of attacking it froze, mesmerized by the streams of data surrounding it. The python spirit, ancient, powerful, but suddenly curious about this new form of energy. Elisa's eyes cleared momentarily. The child, he gasped. It's already choosing both. Around them, family members dropped to their knees as the python spirit's grip weakened, replaced by something new. The digital age had come for the Nwachukwu legacy, ready or not. Thunder cracked again, and rain finally fell. Not water, but numbers. Endless strings of code washing away centuries of blood while preserving the power beneath it. Adana felt her child move again, stronger this time. This baby would know both worlds, the power of ancient spirits and the strength of modern innovation. The true price of legacy wasn't blood or death, but evolution. The night wasn't over yet. Dawn approached the Nwachukwu estate, turning the sky the color of old bronze. The rain of numbers had stopped, leaving the ground covered in a phosphorescent pattern of digits and ancient symbols merged into something entirely new. Adana stood in the center of the courtyard, her phone now dark but humming with residual power. The python spirit coiled in the air above them, its scales reflecting both moonlight and digital code. Her mother-in-law lay unconscious on the mansion steps, the shattered calabash beside her. The old bargain is broken, Uncle Namdi announced, his voice carrying the weight of generations. The points of his filed teeth had dulled, becoming normal again. But power abhors a vacuum. What price will you offer, daughter of new money? Elisa struggled to his feet, his eyes now their normal warm brown. He moved to stand beside Adana, one hand protective over their unborn child. I offer integration, Adana declared, her tech entrepreneur's mind seeing possibilities where others saw only chaos. The python spirit doesn't need blood to survive, it needs evolution. The massive serpent lowered its head, fixing her with eyes that now held streams of binary code within their ancient depths. Your family bound it to blood and sacrifice, she continued, addressing both the spirit and the gathered Nwachukwus. I bind it to innovation. Every technological breakthrough, every digital advancement, every step forward will feed it. Not with death, but with progress. The python spirit rippled, its scales shifting between physical and digital forms. And the child, her mother-in-law asked weakly, regaining consciousness. What will it become? A bridge, Elisa answered, understanding at last. neither bound by blind tradition nor lost in soulless technology, both Python and processor. The spirit moved suddenly, coiling around Adana and Elisa. But instead of crushing them, it merged into their skin, leaving behind markings that look like circuit boards rendered in ancient Igbo symbols. The price of legacy, Uncle Namdi nodded, is adaptation. As sunrise painted the mansion gold, Adana felt the full weight of what they'd achieved. The Nwachukwu wealth would continue, but differently. Their child would inherit both the Python's power and the digital age's potential, becoming something unprecedented. Her phone sparked back to life, showing her company's logo intertwined with the Nwachukwu family crest. Below it, bank accounts adjusted themselves, converting blood-bought assets into clean digital wealth. The Python spirit now feeding on the energy of innovation rather than the pain of sacrifice. "Ready to build something new?" she asked Elisa. He smiled, touching the circuit board patterns on his skin. "Our own legacy?" Around them, the Nwachukwu family began to stir, their eyes now holding a mix of binary code and ancestral wisdom. The mansion itself seemed to breathe differently, ancient power flowing through modern fiber optic cables. The sun rose fully, illuminating a new kind of family empire, one where Python scripts could literally talk to Python spirits, where blockchain met blood magic, and where the price of legacy was no longer death, but transformation. In the distance, Lagos was waking up, unaware that its oldest money had just merged with its newest technology, creating something that would change everything. Adana smiled, feeling her baby kick. The future would be interesting, indeed. The end.